Okay, so now we've come to our last segment on education, and we're looking at race and issues of how does race determine your outcomes? We've seen that the education system doesn't necessarily increase your ability to improve your position in life. It often functions to keep us where we are, to decrease our mobility, or at least just keep us kind of in the same place. And again, we're asking how that happens. And today, on this set of slides, we want to pay attention to the role of race. How does it actually happen? What do people do? How does the system work? One key component we can look at is the question of tracking and teacher expectancies. Tracking, also known as streaming, which I think makes a little bit more intuitive sense, is how we tend to guide our students as teachers towards particular tracks. We tend to push them in particular directions to encourage them to go in particular ways educationally. One way we can gauge tracking is through advanced placement and gifted and talented programs. And we'll look at that in a minute. But I want to think a little bit about teacher expectancy effects in general and what we call a stereotype threat. The expectations of our teachers and the way they treat us can often affect the way we perform. We've seen this in the class divided video that I showed in class. When Jane Elliott started treating brown-eyed students differently than the blue-eyed students, she saw that their test scores went down when she treated them as though they were less good. Now, it wasn't that the people changed, it wasn't that they actually got dumber, it was that she was treating them differently, and so they thought what they could do changed. And this is true of all students. When students are treated like a problem, if students are treated like they're not smart, if students are treated like there are low expectations of them, often they tend to meet those low expectations. What this means is that if teachers have hidden biases, then students tend to meet those biases. So if my teacher doesn't call on me in class, if my teacher calls me out for being disruptive and not the other white student, all of these start to tell me about who I am in very subtle ways. Stereotype threat is a particular effect we see. And what this is, and it's a very strange thing, but essentially this is what was going on in Jane Elliott's classroom. Stereotype threat is if we're worried about being stereotyped as dumb or disruptive, then we can often, the fear of that stereotype affects how we perform academically. We perform less well because of the threat of the stereotype. Now, if we look at this chart, we start to look at the issue of tracking. So many schools have, if they can afford it, AP courses or advanced placement courses that are kind of somewhere between college and high school, that are harder, have more work at a higher level. These courses look great on a resume for college. They also have gifted and talented programs. These are for children who have more emotional sensitivity or have particular academic gifts. If you're really good in math, maybe you'll be put into a gifted math course. I was really bad in math. I was put into a remedial math course. That means that it was math for slow kids like me. And here I have a PhD today, and I probably couldn't do a quadratic equation to save my life. Let's look at these racial disparities here. White students are placed in the AP and gifted and talented programs much more. Now, this doesn't mean white kids are more gifted and talented or smarter in some way. How do we know that? Well, we do some experiments. So Fish, for example, did an experiment where he sent out to teachers different narratives of students. These narratives would contain all the details teachers needed to know where they wanted to recommend students for testing for particular kinds of programs. Some would be for behavioral issues, so if students had some emotional or behavioral challenges, acting up in class, that kind of thing, they would be tested for that. If they were like me, kind of a slow math kid, they could be tested for that. Or if they had academic strengths, they could be recommended for gifted testing. So these vignettes or stories about students would tell teachers all they needed to know to recommend for particular kinds of testing or not. And what he did was he would send the exact same narrative, but just change the race, maybe the name of the student, from Mark to Laquan. And while that might seem kind of racist-ish, often we pick up on those subtle details. And so sociologists use that to judge racial ideas. What Fish found was that if students, for example, had academic challenges, meaning they needed a little help in certain areas, whites were more often referred for testing for learning disabilities or learning differences than black and brown students. In other words, in white students, this was seen as a problem of being behind, but for black and brown students, teachers more often thought it was just normal. When we look at behavioral challenges, acting up, disruptive behavior, whites were less often referred for testing. In other words, for white students, this was just seen as average, normal behavior. But for black and brown students, it was seen as a problem, something that needed to be dealt with. When we think about the fact that black students are suspended out of school at much higher rates than white students, and every day of being suspended out of school lowers your likelihood of succeeding, this is an important finding. And lastly, whites were more likely to be referred for testing for gifted or academic excellence. Again, what this means is that even when black or brown students were performing quite well, were performing in a gifted way, teachers didn't see it. They just saw it as normal, whereas white students were referred for AP or gifted. So when we want to understand racial differences in educational achievement, part of it comes from teachers. They stream or track students into programs that help or hinder them, that keep them in place or help them get ahead. And they do this differently for white and non-white students. Segregation is another major issue. What we look at here is the share of students in majority black students in majority white schools, in the South in particular. After Brown versus Board of Education, which ended legal segregation, and then after the Civil Rights Act, we see this number skyrockets to almost 50% of black students in majority white schools. But that number has been declining since the Supreme Court overturned the mandatory desegregation law. Why is this important? Well, it's a complicated question, but if you think about your public schools are actually funded by a particular kind of tax on property, or local property taxes. Now, when we look at the housing market, we know that local property taxes, property values tend to decrease in majority black neighborhoods. This is because of racist ideas about black homeowners, but also because of the general inequality in terms of income and wealth between black and white residents. What this means is that if you're in a majority black school district, often there's going to be less property value and thus less money coming in from property taxes, and so your school is going to have less money. So here we're looking at a map of racial diversity by county. These darker areas mean that there's a greater deal of racial diversity. We are going to be unsurprised by the fact that the northern and central climes of this country are pretty white. Now let's look at an overlay with the amount of spending per student by school district. So we see that while there is in these poorer, more rural areas, we see that in many of these more diverse school districts, there's a lot less spending per student below the national average in the more racially diverse districts. Why does this matter? Well, funding affects pretty much everything. If you went to a school that had old books, that had a broken down basketball board, that couldn't afford a football team, that had a lot of teacher turnover and didn't seem to have very good teachers. All of these things are due to funding. We see much more concentrated poverty in segregated schools. Right? Schools with concentrated poverty are intensely minority, whereas schools with no poverty are mostly white. So funding is a huge issue. And this is done at the local level. And let's think about this practically. We could change the way we tax and fund schools, but we haven't. And this serves to keep poor black students in less funded schools and give them less opportunities. So again, this is one of the ways in which education maintains the status quo. Moreover, we know that students who did go to majority white schools, we see that the expectations of the students around them matter. And so, pardon the interruption. So we saw that the transmission of expectations, meaning that if other students in my class are thinking of going to college, I'm going to be going to college. Or we're thinking about it, if they're going to a fancy college, I might think about going to a fancy college. So we see that students from racially diverse schools are more likely to be friends as adults with people who look different from them and comfortable with them. So segregation matters. Now we see the completion rates here are getting better. The gap between these different groups, we might know, is narrowing, which is good. But we still have a lot of issues, and there are practical ways in which we as a society can address them.